The wind that morning was the kind that never stopped talking, the kind that pushed dust through door cracks and whispered about what a woman ought to be. Martha Hayes knew that voice well. It had followed her since the day her mama died, since the first time someone said she wasn't the pretty kind. And now, standing in front of Mrs. Hollis's sewing shop with her calloused hands clutching a small parcel of fabric, she could hear it again, that same old whisper telling her to turn back. But she didn't. She needed the work. Inside, the smell of starch and lavender filled the room. 3 women bent over sewing tables looked up when the doorbell chimed. Their gazes traveled over Martha's plain calico dress, her worn boots, the loose strands of chestnut hair she hadn't managed to pin right. Mrs. Hollis, tall, gray hair coiled tight as her manners, stepped out from behind the counter. "Well now," she said, her voice sweetened with judgment. "I thought you'd given up trying." "Miss Hayes, I heard you needed hands," Martha answered, keeping her tone level. "I can sew fine seams, ma'am. Straight and quick." Mrs. Hollis gave a small laugh that wasn't really a laugh at all. "We do need hands, yes, but our clients expect a certain presentation. You know how it is. A woman representing this shop should look the part." Martha felt her cheeks heat. "Needle don't care how a person looks, Mrs. Hollis." "Needle might not," the older woman said, "but paying customers do." The words hit like grit in her teeth. Around her, the other women pretended to work, but their eyes didn't leave her. One whispered something. Bless her heart. And a few snickers followed. Martha nodded stiffly, setting the fabric down. "I understand," she said, though she didn't, not really. She turned to leave, but her fingers were shaking. The parcel slipped, scattering scraps across the floor, and that's when she saw the boots, dusty, scuffed, belonging to a man who stooped to help before she could. He gathered the pieces carefully, stacking them in her hands. "You dropped these," he said, voice steady, low like a creek under ice. She blinked at him, tall, weathered dark hair streaked with silver, the kind of man who didn't seem to notice or care who was watching. "Thank you," she muttered. He nodded once, eyes unreadable. "You don't owe me that." She meant to walk away then, but something about him, the stillness, the quiet certainty, made her pause. "You from around here?" she asked. "Used to be," he said. "Ryder's place, out past the ridge. Been fixing fences and keeping to myself." Martha smiled faintly, though her throat ached. "Sounds peaceful," he tilted his head. "You don't sound like you believe it." "I guess peace don't visit women like me," she said softly. He didn't answer right away. Just looked at her, really looked, like he was seeing the person behind the dust. "Maybe it just ain't been invited yet," he said finally. She wanted to laugh at that, but her eyes stung instead. She turned away, embarrassed by how easily her guard slipped. The man, Cale Ryder, she recalled now, touched his hat brim in quiet farewell and walked out into the wind. By evening, the sky had turned to iron. Clouds rolled in heavy and low, and Martha trudged home through the dust, her shawl pulled tight. Behind her, the sewing shop lights glowed warm, a reminder of everything she wasn't. That night, as she sat by the small stove, the wind howled through the gaps in her roof. Her fingers, raw from cold, rested on her lap. She whispered to no one. "I'm not the kind of person men would choose." Outside, the wind shifted direction, carrying the faint sound of hooves in the distance. Slow, deliberate, as if someone else hadn't quite finished that conversation. And though she didn't yet know it, the man who'd picked up her scraps of cloth would soon return, not to pity her, but to prove her wrong. By nightfall, the wind had turned mean, the kind that bit at your ears and made the lantern flame crawl sideways. Martha wrapped her shawl tighter and kept walking, each step a small argument with herself. She'd told her landlord she'd be fine out in the old shed for a few days, cheap rent and no one to see her face. But the shed had no door worth closing, and when the storm began to rattle its bones, she knew she wouldn't last till morning. The road stretched empty ahead, just the sound of wind scraping against the dry grass. Her boots were soaked through and the hem of her dress clung to her knees. That was when she spotted it, a faint, steady glow beyond the ridge. Not lightning, not stars, firelight. She hesitated. Folks in this country didn't always welcome strangers at night. Still, cold had a way of silencing pride. She turned toward the light. By the time she reached the cabin, her fingers were too numb to knock. She just stood there, shivering, staring at the yellow glow leaking through the cracks. Then, Before she could decide, the door opened. Cale Ryder filled the doorway, coat half-buttoned, hair damp from the same wind that whipped her face. His eyes widened a little, not in surprise exactly, but in recognition. "Miss Hayes," he said simply. "You look half frozen." "I was headed home," she lied softly. "But the storm's got no mercy tonight." He stepped aside, his voice calm, practical. "Come in before it finishes what the town started." Something in the way he said that made her chest tighten. She stepped inside. The air smelled of wood smoke and coffee grounds. The cabin was small, neat, almost careful. One chair, one bedroll, a pot over the stove. "Don't worry," he said as he latched the door. "Ain't got much, but it's dry." She nodded, unsure where to stand. The fire threw gold light across the rough boards, catching on his hands as he poured water into a tin cup. "Sit," he said, setting it down for her. "You'll thaw faster if you stop trembling." She managed a quiet laugh. Hard to stop when your bones forgot how to be warm. He smiled a little, the kind of smile that didn't reach his mouth but softened his eyes. "That's what the fire's for." They didn't speak much after that. Just the sound of crackling wood and the storm pressing against the walls. When he moved to adjust the stovepipe, she noticed how carefully he worked. Not quick, not showy, just deliberate. "I should thank you," she said after a while. "Not everyone opens their door to someone like me." Cale leaned against the table. "Someone like you?" She looked down, twisting the cup between her palms. "Plain. Unwanted. I'm not the kind of person men would choose." The words hung there, sharp and quiet. He didn't rush to fill the silence. When he finally spoke, it was low, steady. "Then they're not men." She looked up, startled, but he was already turning back to the stove, tapping ash from a stick into the tray. He spoke again, softer this time. "You work hard, keep to yourself, don't beg the world to notice." "Ain't nothing wrong with that." Her throat tightened. "You talk like you've seen folks like me before." "I have," he said. Mostly in the mirror. The room fell still. The storm's roar dulled to a hum, the kind that made you forget for a moment that you were supposed to be alone. Later, when she lay on the cot he'd given her, listening to the wind scrape along the shutters, she caught herself smiling, a small, tired, disbelieving smile. She thought about his words, about the way he'd said they're not men, like it wasn't a compliment, but a truth carved from something deeper. Outside, the storm eased, leaving the world cold but clean. Inside, the fire burned slow and steady, and for the first time in a long while, Martha Hayes felt seen, not as a burden, not as a plain woman, but as someone who had survived the wind and was still standing. By morning, the storm had spent itself, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt almost fragile. The world outside was white and still. Snow crusted on every fence rail, every branch bowed with the weight of it. Cale Ryder stood by the stove, stirring the last of the coffee grounds. The cabin smelled of smoke and thawing wool. Behind him, Martha stirred from her corner cot, the blanket sliding from her shoulders. "Morning," he said without turning. Her voice was soft, still half caught in sleep. "Didn't think I'd wake up at all." Storm sounded like it meant to take the roof. He chuckled under his breath. "It's a stubborn roof. I built it myself." She smiled faintly. "Then I'm grateful for your stubbornness." He handed her a tin cup, steam curling between them. "Ain't fancy, but it'll wake you." She took it carefully, hands still sore from cold. "I used to make coffee like this for my father," she said. "He said it was the only thing I did right." Cale looked over his shoulder, studying her face. She said it lightly, but he could hear the bruise beneath the words. "Sounds like he wasn't much of a judge," he said. Her gaze dropped to the cup, the surface trembling just a little. "He judged plenty. Folks like him always do." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was just real, the kind that hung between two people who understood loss too well to speak of it quickly. Cale broke it first. "You can stay till the snow melts," he said, matter of fact. "Road's too slick for town anyway. I don't want to trouble you. Wouldn't have offered if it was trouble." He paused, stirring the fire with a poker. "Could use an extra hand fixing the barn door if you're set on paying your way." Something in his tone, not pity, not charity, just plain respect, loosened something inside her. "All right," she said. "But I warn you, I don't take orders easy." He grinned. "Then we'll call it a partnership." The day passed in quiet rhythm. Wood chopped, snow shoveled, the sound of boots on frozen boards. Martha worked beside him, sleeves rolled, cheeks pink from cold. Once, when her hand slipped on a nail, he reached to steady her. She froze at the touch, not used to being handled gently. "You're all right," he said, his hand warm around hers. I haven't done much of this before," she admitted. He shrugged. "Most things worth doing you learn as you go." Later, while he fixed the latch, she found herself sweeping the floor, humming without realizing it. It had been years since a tune came that easily. When dusk fell, Cale lit the kerosene lamp. The soft gold filled the cabin, touching the worn wood and their tired faces. He handed her a small, leather-bound notebook, edges frayed, half the pages blank. "Found it in town last month," he said. "Figured someone ought to use it." She looked at it like it might burn her fingers. "You want me to write?" "Only if you've got something worth saying." She opened to the first page, staring at the empty lines. "Not sure I do." He leaned back in the chair. "Everyone does. World just talks louder than most folks can answer." That night, while he pretended to read, she began to write. Slow, uneven, but steady. Words she hadn't spoken to anyone in years spilled onto the page. Not poetry, not stories, just pieces of truth. How the wind used to scare her. How silence sometimes felt like kindness. How one man's gentleness could shift the shape of her whole world. When she looked up, Cale had dozed off in the chair, head bowed. The fire burned low, painting him in a soft orange glow. She closed the notebook and whispered to herself, "Maybe peace really can be invited." Outside, snow fell again, quiet, forgiving, and new. By the time the snow melted, spring had begun creeping down the hills, thin rivulets of water tracing through the dust, birds testing their voices again. The world was waking up, and with it came the whispers. Martha could feel them before she ever reached town. Eyes from behind lace curtains, heads turning a second too long. It wasn't the first time she'd been talked about, but this time the weight of it pressed harder. Because now she had something worth losing. A little peace, a little pride, maybe even a friend. Cale had offered to come along, help her trade the wool and sugar. "Don't owe me that," she'd said. But he'd saddled the horse anyway, quiet as ever. The ride into town was wordless. The road, still half muddy, glistened under a mild sun. Martha rode side saddle, hands folded tight in her lap. Cale glanced her way now and then, as if measuring the silence between them. "You don't have to face them alone," he finally said. She smiled, though her lips barely held it. "You forget, Mr. Ryder, a woman like me's been facing folks her whole life." He didn't argue. He just nodded once, that slow, respectful way of his that meant he understood. The general store bell rang as they stepped inside. Every sound seemed louder than it ought to. The creak of the floorboards, the shuffle of sacks. Mrs. Hollis was there, of course, standing near the counter like she'd been waiting for a moment exactly like this. "Well, if it isn't Miss Hayes," she said, voice sugary enough to rot teeth. "Or should I say Mrs. Ryder?" A few women near the shelves pretended to look busy, pretending not to listen. Martha's heart kicked once in her chest. "That's not my name," she said, steady as she could. "Oh?" Mrs. Hollis's eyebrows arched high. "Then what is it, dear? Folks been saying you've been living out there with that man all winter. I do hope I've been misinformed." The room felt smaller suddenly, air thick with the sweet smell of flour and judgment. Martha caught sight of Cale standing by the door, his jaw tight, eyes locked on Mrs. Hollis, but saying nothing. Martha could have stayed quiet. She usually did. But something inside her shifted. Maybe it was all those months of silence, or the sound of her own name said like dirt. Either way, she straightened her shoulders. "No, ma'am," she said calmly. "You're not misinformed. I stayed in his cabin through the storm. I cooked, I mended, I worked my share, and he never once asked for anything but honesty." Mrs. Hollis blinked, momentarily thrown off by the steadiness in Martha's tone. "So you admit it then?" "You stayed with him." Martha nodded once. "I did. Because the wind don't ask whether you've got a husband before it tries to kill you. And kindness doesn't come dressed in lace." The room went quiet enough to hear the stove tick. Mrs. Hollis's mouth pinched. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose some folks have no shame." Before Cale could step forward, Martha raised her chin higher. "And some folks mistake shame for decency," she said softly. "But I stopped begging to be seen through someone else's eyes. She turned, placing her few coins on the counter. "I'll take the sugar and the thread." Outside, the air smelled of wet dust and lilac. Cale followed her out, his steps heavy but measured. "You handled that fine," he said quietly. "I didn't do it fine," she answered, her voice trembling. "I just did it." He looked at her, the faintest smile tugging at his mouth. "That's better than most." They stood there for a moment, two silhouettes against a sky, trying to remember spring. Behind them, the bell jingled again, more whispers starting, no doubt. But Martha didn't flinch this time. She looked toward the open road, shoulders squared, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like the plain woman in someone else's story. She felt like her own name, simple, unadorned, and strong. The town never did say sorry, not out loud, but spring has a way of softening things that winter makes hard: the soil, the light, even people. Weeks passed. The snow vanished from the hills, leaving behind green shoots that pushed through the mud like hope testing its luck. Cale Ryder's cabin no longer felt like a place apart from the world. It felt like a small breathing piece of it. Martha had taken to keeping the window open while she worked, letting the scent of wild sage drift through. She wrote in the evenings now, pages upon pages in that old leather notebook, her words uneven but honest. Some nights she'd catch herself reading them aloud, and for the first time, her own voice didn't sound strange in her ears. One afternoon, while she was hanging laundry, she saw Cale riding back from town. His horse moved slow, deliberate, same as him. But something in his posture told her he'd been thinking hard the whole way home. He dismounted, tied the reins, and handed her a folded paper. "For you," she hesitated. "What is it?" "Letter from the school board," he said. "They're looking for someone to teach reading to the little ones." "I mentioned your name." Her eyes widened. "Cale." "I never even finished school myself," he shrugged. "Maybe that's why you do it right. You know what it's like to learn slow and mean it." She held the paper as if it were something fragile. Her first instinct was to refuse. She'd been told too long she wasn't fit for such things. But she saw the quiet certainty in his face and felt something stir, something that had been asleep for years. "You really think I could?" He met her eyes, steady and kind. "I don't think, Martha." "I know." The words hit her harder than she expected. She turned away, pretending to fuss with the wash line, but her hands were trembling. That Sunday, she walked into the little white schoolhouse for the first time. A handful of children sat waiting, some barefoot, some fidgeting with pencils too short to hold. The smell of chalk and old wood filled the air. At first her voice came out shy, quivering like the first note of a hymn. But when she read from one of her own pages, a story about a storm, a cabin, and a man who fixed broken things, the children leaned in close. They didn't laugh. They listened. By the time the bell rang, she realized she hadn't thought once about how she looked. That evening, when she returned home, the sunset had turned the sky the color of copper. Cale was sitting on the porch, sharpening a tool, a pot of coffee steaming beside him. He looked up as she climbed the steps. "How'd it go?" She smiled, cheeks flushed from the walk. "They didn't throw me out." "That's a start," he said, grinning. She sank into the chair beside him. "One of the little girls said my story made her feel brave." He nodded slowly. "Then I reckon it's done its job." For a while they sat in silence, watching the horizon swallow the sun. The air was warm, soft with promise. Finally she spoke. "You ever think about what folks said about me, about us?" He put down the file, looked at her for a long moment. "Used to," he admitted. "But then I realized folks only talk that much when they see something they wish they had." Her throat tightened. "You always make it sound simple," he smiled. "Ain't simple. Just true." As the last light faded, the wind carried the smell of fresh rain over the valley. Martha leaned back, eyes half closed. "Cale?" "I think," she said softly, "I finally understand what it means to be chosen." He reached over, covered her hand with his, rough fingers gentle. "You were never unchosen, Martha. You were just waiting for someone who saw right." The night settled around them, quiet, forgiving, alive. The fire inside the cabin burned low, but the room stayed warm. And out there, beneath the wide Wyoming sky, two people who'd been told they weren't enough finally believed they were.